In the spring of 1452, the eternal city of Rome blazed with light. Torches flared along marble corridors. Choirs echoed in Latin hymns, and a young princess from Portugal walked into history. Her name was Eleonore. Beside her stood Frederick III, the Holy Roman Emperor. Watching from the crowd was Aeneas Silvius Piccolomini, a court humanist who would later become Pope Pius II. He recorded what he saw that day: a bride so radiant, so full of promise, that she seemed destined to be more than a queen. He called her a jewel from the south, a gift carried across seas and kingdoms. But history is crueler than any witness. Just 15 years later, Eleonore was no longer a jewel. She was a shadow locked inside the stone walls of Wiener Neustadt, her body burning with plague, her name already fading from the records. No triumphant hymns, no roaring crowds. Not even her husband stood at her side. She had given birth to the boy who would one day be Emperor Maximilian I, a ruler celebrated across Europe. Yet his mother's fate was silence. This is the paradox of power. A woman who once walked through Rome as the brightest bride of Christendom ended her days as if she had never lived at all. And if Pope Pius II could see her glory, why did no one remember her fall? How could a woman crowned as empress die like an exile in her own palace? Tonight, we will uncover the forgotten tragedy of Empress Eleonore of Portugal. We will trace the path from the splendor of her wedding to the suffocating chamber where disease claimed her at just 32. We will ask why the empire she helped shape allowed her name to be erased. Stay with us until the end, for this is not just the story of a plague, but of a woman swallowed by silence. And if you seek to witness more of history's hidden wounds, subscribe now, because some names deserve to be spoken again. And tonight, Eleonore will not be forgotten. Eleonore of Portugal entered the world as the daughter of two crowns. Her father was King Duarte of Portugal, a ruler remembered for his chivalry and devotion to ideals higher than himself. His reign was brief, and he died when Eleonore was only 2 years old, leaving behind not just a throne but a lingering sense of loss that shaped the childhood of his daughter. To her, he was not a man of flesh and voice, but a memory carried in stories told by courtiers and in prayers whispered by her mother. The young princess grew up in the shadow of a father she barely knew, and the silence of his absence gave her a kind of seriousness beyond her years. Her mother was Eleonore of Aragon, daughter of Ferdinand of Aragon, a woman of iron will who had seen courts divided by ambition and alliances built through sacrifice. From her, Eleonore inherited not only a bloodline that reached across Iberia, but also the stern lessons of survival. The queen taught her daughter that every smile at court could conceal calculation, and that a princess's destiny was never her own. Through her mother's eyes, Eleonore learned that beauty and charm mattered, but discipline and obedience would decide her fate. Life in the Portuguese palace offered both warmth and weight. Eleonore grew amid gardens of orange blossoms, fountains echoing with laughter, and corridors alive with music from lutes and flutes. Yet behind the beauty was expectation. Her lineage tied her to the House of Avis through her father and to the crown of Aragon through her mother. She was not only the child of one kingdom, but the living bridge of two dynasties, destined to be bartered in the great game of Europe. From an early age, she was groomed for a stage far larger than Lisbon. Tutors instructed her in Latin, in courtly manners, and in the art of appearing serene even when fear pressed against the heart. Ladies-in-waiting wrapped her in silks that seemed less like garments than banners, symbols of alliances not yet made. Her youth was marked by ceremony, And though she could run and ride with her brothers and cousins, she was always reminded that one day she would be sent away. That day came with the promise of a marriage to Frederick, the Holy Roman Emperor. The match dazzled many. For Portugal, it meant prestige and a bond with a realm that spanned across Central Europe. For Frederick, it brought the wealth of her dowry and the strength of Portuguese trade. For Eleonore, it meant leaving behind the gardens of Lisbon and the guiding presence of her mother. She was only 16 when the decision was sealed, and the course of her life was bound to a distant land whose language and customs were unknown. Her departure was marked by splendor. Chronicles describe a procession of horses draped in velvet, carriages laden with treasures, and jewels that glittered under the Iberian sun. Crowds filled the roads, some cheering with pride, others weeping quietly, for they understood the truth. A princess sent abroad was a gift given away forever. Eleanore herself must have felt the weight of both triumph and exile. Behind the glitter lay the knowledge that she was leaving not only her homeland, but the embrace of her mother who had prepared her for this moment. When she arrived in Rome to meet Frederick, she was no longer simply the daughter of Duarte and Eleanor. She stood as the Empress-to-be, a young woman who carried within her the memory of a father lost too soon, and the lessons of a mother who had armed her with dignity. She walked forward with confidence, believing that all the years of preparation had led her to a destiny worthy of her blood. Yet destiny has its shadows, and beyond the wedding bells of Rome waited a silence more profound than anything her mother had warned her about. In the first years of her life as Empress, Eleanore discovered that triumph was not made only of crowns and ceremonies. It was shaped in chambers where whispers carried more weight than hymns. Still, she stood tall. Her grace and her bloodline gave Frederick an aura of legitimacy that his empire sorely needed. She appeared beside him in processions, and for a time nobles bent their heads with admiration. Her true glory came in 1459 when she bore a son. The child was named Maximilian, and with his birth, the empire's uncertain future took form. On the day she placed him in Frederick's arms, Eleanore searched for a trace of warmth in her husband's face. Instead, she heard him murmur in his careful, measured voice, "He is the empire's future, not yours. Remember that." The words fell like iron. To Frederick, the infant was not a bond of love, but a continuation of power. Eleanore pressed the child closer, her heart torn between pride and fear. She whispered softly in Portuguese, as though protecting him with a language that belonged only to them. One evening, as she rocked Maximilian to sleep, a loyal handmaiden from Lisbon lingered by the window. The woman had followed her mistress across seas and mountains, carrying memories of orange groves and songs from their homeland. She listened as Eleanore hummed a tune, her voice tender and low. "Your voice softens in Portuguese, my lady," the handmaiden whispered. "He will know you belong to another world." Eleanor's eyes shimmered in the candlelight. She looked down at her son and kissed his forehead. "If he carries a piece of me, he will never be alone," she answered. It was not a proclamation, only a fragile hope spoken in the quiet of a foreign palace. At court, envoys came to pay respects, drawn by curiosity as much as loyalty. One Italian ambassador, charmed by her bearing, raised a cup in her honor during a banquet. "Your Highness," he said, his voice echoing through the hall, "you shine brighter than the emperor himself, yet I see too few who stand beside you." The compliment froze the room. Frederick's face remained unreadable, But Eleanore felt the weight of every stare. She smiled with flawless composure. Yet within she understood the truth. Even in triumph she was already alone. Still, for a brief time, she savored her zenith. Maximilian thrived, his laughter filling her chambers. She paraded him before nobles, and in those moments her role was secure. She had given the empire an heir, and the empire could not deny her worth. But beneath the surface, cracks began to spread. Frederick's coldness did not thaw. The courtiers who once praised her now whispered of her foreign ways, and Eleanore, though she stood at the height of her achievement, began to feel the chill of isolation creeping into every hall of stone. Her rise had reached its peak, but already the shadows of decline were gathering. The celebration of Eleanor's triumph faded like smoke. In the echoing halls of Vienna, whispers turned against her. Nobles who once bowed with admiration now narrowed their eyes. They said she brought too much color, too many flavors, too many foreign faces. To them she was no empress, only an intruder from the south. Her isolation deepened with every feast. Laughter would ripple across the table. But the moment she lifted her head, the sound collapsed into silence. Eyes darted away, lips pressed tight, and she was left facing a void. The absence of welcome became its own form of cruelty. One night, passing by a chamber half open, she heard two voices hidden in the shadows. She belongs to the sea, not here, and the emperor keeps her only because of the boy. The words were few, but they pierced with precision. Eleanore stood in the corridor, her hand upon the stone wall, her breath shallow. She did not enter. She did not confront. She moved on, carrying their verdict like a weight upon her chest. The coldness reached even her husband. Frederick spoke to her in tones stripped of warmth, his face unreadable. Once, after a council, she asked softly if he wished her presence at court to continue. He looked at her, steady and unmoved. "You have done your duty. Nothing more is required." The sentence ended any hope she had of closeness. She bowed her head, not in obedience but in resignation, knowing that even the man she had married saw her as a shadow. In her private chambers, only her son and a single handmaiden from Lisbon gave her comfort. When the handmaiden saw her mistress forcing a smile at banquets, she dared to ask why. Eleanore bent over Maximilian's cradle, her fingers brushing the child's cheek. Her voice was calm, almost distant. "If I stop smiling, they will know they have killed me." The words hung in the air, heavier than sobs. The court's cruelty was subtle, yet relentless. When she approached groups of noblewomen, they greeted her with curtsies sharp as knives. One winter evening, a lady remarked with a smile too thin to be kind, "Your Majesty, perhaps the cold is harsh for one raised under eternal sun." The circle laughed, then fell silent as Eleanore inclined her head with flawless poise. She gave no reply, but the humiliation burned. Her world shrank to narrow corridors and a cradle. Each step she took in public was answered by silence. Each attempt to speak met with indifference. No daggers were drawn, no poisons poured. Yet the slow erasure of her presence was its own execution. Eleanore endured, but endurance left scars unseen. She was no longer the jewel who had walked into Rome radiant and full of promise. She was a woman whose every word was swallowed by stone, whose every gesture dissolved into air, and whose name was being erased while she still breathed. The winter had been long, and when the thaw came, it carried with it a whisper darker than frost. In the narrow streets of Wiener Neustadt, Merchants spoke of neighbors taken overnight. Doors were sealed with chalk. Bells tolled at odd hours, and smoke rose from hurried pyres beyond the city walls. At first, the court dismissed these rumors as the panic of commoners. Yet rumor soon gained weight, for death cannot be silenced by decree. The plague crept slowly toward the palace. It arrived on the breath of servants who carried food from the markets, on the clothes of guards who stood too long near the gates, on the silence of courtiers who dared not admit fear. Nobles still feasted, but their laughter was hollow. They drank from goblets of silver, yet their eyes flickered toward every cough, every pale face. Even within marble halls, the invisible enemy was felt. Eleanore sensed it before most. She watched from the high windows as wagons rolled past, burdened not with goods but with bodies shrouded in coarse cloth. The streets that once rang with music when she entered now lay heavy with dread. She had crossed seas to wear a crown, but no crown could shield her from what was drawing near. The first signs in the palace were subtle. A scullery maid vanished, her absence explained with hurried words. A guard at the gate slumped and did not rise again. Still, the court continued its rituals, as though ceremony could protect them. Eleanore walked through those halls and felt the weight of denial pressing in, more suffocating than the illness itself. Then came the moment when denial ended. A nobleman collapsed during a gathering, his skin blotched with dark stains. Panic scattered the room. That same night, the sickness crossed the invisible boundary and entered Eleanor's chamber. She was the first within the imperial household to suffer its touch. At first it was only fatigue, a faint dizziness that made her grasp the carved wood of her chair. Soon her skin burned with fever, her body trembling with weakness. Attendants recoiled even as they bowed, their faces hidden behind cloths soaked in herbs. The Empress, who had once embodied hope for 2 dynasties, now lay fragile before an enemy that cared nothing for lineage. She touched her crown where it rested on the table beside her bed and whispered with bitter clarity, "Gold has no weight against death." Her handmaiden from Lisbon knelt at her side, tears brimming in her eyes. Eleanor's gaze remained steady, though her voice faltered. "If I am the first, I will not be the last. The plague will have more power here than any emperor." The palace grew still around her. Courtiers who had once vied for her attention avoided her door. Frederick visited rarely, and when he did, his silence was colder than stone. The woman who had given the empire its heir now found herself abandoned, a solitary figure marked by disease. She endured each wave of fever, each chill that shook her frame, with the composure of one who had been trained all her life to hide weakness. Yet within the flicker of her eyes, there was a truth she could no longer conceal. Even the might of an empire bends before the plague. Even a crown cannot command the breath to remain. Night fell heavily over Wiener Neustadt. The corridors of the palace were quiet, not with the stillness of peace, but with the hush of fear. Servants moved like shadows, carrying candles that flickered against stone walls. Within her chamber, Eleanore lay weakened, her breath shallow, her body consumed by the fever that had already marked her as lost. She asked for no grand gathering, no procession of priests, no music of the court. What she held instead was the silence of a room scented faintly with smoke and herbs. At her bedside, the handmaiden from Lisbon remained, her eyes red with grief, yet determined not to leave her mistress. On the table rested a crown untouched, its gold catching the candlelight with cruel indifference. Eleanor's thoughts were fixed on the child she had brought into this world. They placed Maximilian in her arms for a brief moment, a mercy granted before the physicians insisted he be taken away. She pressed her lips to his forehead, her whisper carrying more weight than any proclamation. "Live freer than I did, my son." The words trembled in the air, a blessing and a plea entwined. When the boy was carried out, the chamber seemed to collapse into emptiness. The Empress leaned back against the pillows, her body frail beneath heavy sheets. She gazed at the crown one last time. It no longer seemed a symbol of triumph, only a relic of a bargain that had stolen her youth. With a faint smile, she murmured, "It never belonged to me, not truly." The hours dragged with merciless slowness. The fire in the hearth shrank to embers. Each candle flickered lower until the chamber was veiled in shadows. The handmaiden held her mistress's hand and whispered prayers, her voice breaking. But Eleanore did not ask her to stop. The Empress closed her eyes, listening instead to the distant toll of bells. They rang not for her, but for the city where death walked openly through the streets. In the final hour, her breath grew more ragged, each inhalation a struggle, each exhalation a surrender. She did not cry out. She did not fight. She accepted the weight pressing upon her chest as though it were another duty, one last command from a destiny she could not refuse. A sudden draft stirred the curtains. The sound of wind rose faintly against the walls. Eleanore opened her eyes once more. She seemed to look not at the handmaiden, not at the crown, but beyond, toward something unseen. For a fleeting instant, her expression softened, as though she saw the ocean of her childhood, the orchards of her youth, the father she barely remembered, the mother who had prepared her for sacrifice. Then the vision faded. Her lips parted with a final breath that lingered in the air like a broken prayer. The handmaiden wept silently, clutching her mistress's lifeless hand. Outside the chamber, the palace remained silent, the empire unchanged, the emperor absent. The Empress of the Holy Roman Empire, daughter of Portugal, mother of Maximilian, had left the world at only 32 years of age. There were no trumpets, no songs, no great lamentation. There was only the hollow sound of bells tolling in the distance and the cold echo of her absence settling within stone walls. When the candles burned out in her chamber, the court moved on as though nothing had changed. There was no public mourning, no procession through the streets, no lament carved into the chronicles. Eleanor's name was whispered briefly, then swallowed by silence. The empire she had crossed seas to join did not stop to honor her. The crown rested on another table, ready to be worn at the next ceremony. Yet history is never entirely silent. Though courtiers averted their eyes and Frederick turned his back, there remained one figure who could never erase her, the child she had pressed to her breast. Maximilian would one day become an emperor whose shadow stretched across Europe. He built alliances, commanded armies, and carried the Habsburg name into an age of dominance. Behind his triumphs was the memory of a mother who had held him in the quiet of a fevered room. He spoke rarely of her, yet traces lingered in the gentleness with which he remembered Portugal, a land he had never seen but that lived in him through her lullabies. The palace of Wiener Neustadt still stands. Its walls hold no inscription of her name, no statue honors her sacrifice, but within those stones lies the echo of her last breath. The same corridors that once resounded with laughter falling silent at her approach are now walked by visitors who know nothing of the woman who died there. The silence remains, as if the building itself remembers what men have forgotten. Her story is the story of power undone by fragility, of a jewel dimmed not by scandal, but by neglect. She was not betrayed by daggers or poison, but by indifference. In that indifference lies a cruelty more enduring than violence. It is the cruelty of erasure. Eleonore of Portugal was 32 when the plague claimed her. She was an empress who gave birth to a dynasty, yet died as though she had never existed. That is the paradox her memory leaves behind. She mattered so deeply to the survival of the Habsburg line. Yet to the court around her, she was less than a shadow. As we end her story, let us not allow silence to claim her again. Every stone of Wiener Neustadt, every page of history that neglected her, calls us to remember. If the walls can still whisper, then so must we. This is why we tell her story now, to break the silence that once buried her, to give voice to the woman who carried an empire's air, yet received no honor in her death. If you have walked with Eleonore through her brief light and her long shadow, do not let her name vanish once more. Share her tragedy. Let others hear it. And subscribe to this channel so that the forgotten can be remembered. For in speaking her name aloud, we deny history the right to erase her.